The knock came at dawn. 3 sharp raps that made your heart jump into your throat. You knew what it meant. The landlord's man come to collect rent you didn't have. Your husband had been dead for 2 months. Fever took him in less than a week, and now you were alone with 3 children under the age of 7. The law said everything he'd owned became yours, but there was nothing to inherit. Just debts. Mountains of debts you didn't even know existed. The landlord didn't care that you were grieving. He didn't care that you had no income, no skills anyone would pay for, no family willing to take you in. He wanted his money, and if you couldn't pay, he'd put you and your children on the street by nightfall. You stood there in your thin nightdress, your youngest crying in the next room, and realized that your life had just become a fight for survival you had almost no chance of winning. In the early to mid-1700s across England, colonial America, and much of Europe, widowhood was a death sentence for most women. Society was structured around the assumption that women belonged to men, first to their fathers, then to their husbands. A woman alone had no legal standing, no economic power, and almost no protection under the law. When a husband died, his widow inherited his debts but rarely his assets. If there were sons, they received the property. If there were no children, the estate often went to the husband's male relatives. The widow got whatever was left, which was usually nothing. She couldn't own property in her own name in most places. She couldn't enter into contracts. She couldn't sue or be sued. She existed in a legal gray area where she had responsibilities but no rights, and society viewed her with suspicion. A woman without a husband was seen as dangerous, sexually available, a potential threat to other marriages. Neighbors who'd been friendly when her husband was alive suddenly turned cold. Shopkeepers refused her credit. Churches offered prayers but little practical help. She was expected to survive on charity, but charity was scarce and came with conditions. Widows were told to be grateful, humble, and above all, quiet about their suffering. Eleanor Marsh was 26 when her husband died. They'd been married for 8 years, living in a small rented house on the outskirts of Norwich. Her husband Thomas worked as a cooper making barrels for local merchants. The pay was decent, not comfortable but enough to keep them fed and housed. Eleanor had never worked outside the home. She'd spent her days cooking, cleaning, caring for their 3 children, managing the household. That was her job, and she'd done it well. Then Thomas caught typhoid fever. He was dead within 6 days. Eleanor was left with 3 children, ages 2, 4, and 6. No savings, no income, and rent due in 2 weeks. She went to Thomas's employer, hoping they might help. They gave her 5 shillings and told her that was all they could spare. She went to the parish church. Priest said he'd pray for her and suggested she find work. But what work? She had no training, no connections. Women's labor was paid a fraction of what men earned, and most of that work was already taken by younger, unmarried women. Eleanor tried anyway. She offered to take in washing, but there were already a dozen other women doing the same, and none of them were making enough to live on. She tried to get work as a servant, but no one wanted to hire a woman with 3 small children. The children were the problem. They needed care. They needed food. They needed her attention. And that meant she couldn't work full days or take live-in positions. The rent came due. Eleanor didn't have it. The landlord gave her 1 week's extension, then evicted her. She and her children were on the street with nothing but the clothes they were wearing and a small bundle of belongings. They spent the first night in a church doorway. It was October and the nights were getting cold. Her youngest, a boy named William, coughed through the night. Her daughter, Anne, cried and asked when they could go home. Eleanor had no answer. She tried the workhouse next. Workhouses were the last resort, places where the desperately poor could go for shelter and food in exchange for labor. But they were also places of horror. Families were separated. Men, women, and children were housed in different sections and rarely saw each other. The work was brutal. The food was barely edible. Disease spread fast in the overcrowded, filthy conditions. And once you entered, leaving was almost impossible. Eleanor stood outside the workhouse gates for an hour, holding her children's hands, trying to decide if this was really the only option. In the end, she turned away. She couldn't bring herself to do it. Not yet. So she begged. She stood on street corners with her children and asked for help. Some people gave her a coin or two, most walked past without looking. After 3 days, she'd collected enough to buy a loaf of bread and rent a corner of a cellar room she'd share with 2 other families. There was no community of support, no network of women helping each other. Other poor women saw Eleanor as competition for the same scarce resources. Wealthier women saw her as a cautionary tale, someone whose suffering proved what happened when you didn't have a man to protect you. Eleanor's own family wanted nothing to do with her. Her father had died years ago. Her mother lived with Eleanor's brother, who made it clear that he had his own family to support and couldn't take on 3 more mouths. Eleanor's sister was married to a tradesman who forbade his wife from associating with Eleanor, saying her poverty might be contagious. So Eleanor was alone. Completely, devastatingly alone. She spent her days searching for work, any work. She cleaned stables for pennies. She hauled water. She scrubbed floors in shops. The work was irregular, a day here, half a day there, never enough to add up to real income. And all the while her children grew thinner. William's cough got worse. Anne stopped asking questions and just stared with empty eyes. The youngest, Mary, was too young to understand what was happening, but she cried constantly from hunger. Eleanor felt herself disappearing, not physically, though she was losing weight, but mentally. The exhaustion, the constant fear, the grinding relentlessness of trying to survive on nothing, it was erasing her. She stopped being a person. She was just a body moving through each day, trying to make it to the next. If you were Eleanor, standing on that street corner with 3 starving children, what would you have done? Would you have swallowed your pride and entered the workhouse, knowing it meant losing your children to that system? Would you have kept fighting, kept begging, kept hoping something would change? Or would you have made a darker choice, one that seemed like the only way out? Winter came early that year. By November, the cold was brutal. Eleanor couldn't afford fuel for a fire. They slept huddled together under a single thin blanket in the cellar room. William's cough turned into something worse. His breathing became labored, wheezing. His skin burned with fever. Eleanor knew he needed a doctor, but doctors cost money she didn't have. She tried home remedies, things her mother had taught her, but nothing helped. William died on a Tuesday morning in late November. He was 2 years old. Eleanor couldn't afford a proper burial. The parish provided a pauper's grave, a mass burial pit where dozens of bodies were dumped together and covered with lime. She wasn't allowed to attend. She stood outside the churchyard and listened to the gravedigger's shovel hitting dirt, and she felt something inside her break completely. Anne stopped speaking after William died. She just stared at nothing, her eyes vacant. Mary became listless, barely moving, and Eleanor realized with a cold, creeping certainty that they were all going to die. Not quickly. Slowly, from cold, from hunger, from the diseases that thrived in poverty. She fought as hard as she could, and it wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. But here's the part that makes it worse. The part that reveals how the system really worked. While Eleanor was starving in a cellar, Thomas's brother, who'd inherited the tools and contacts from Thomas's coopering business, was doing fine. He'd taken over the work, kept the income, and never once offered to help Eleanor or the children. This wasn't unusual. This was normal. The law protected men's property rights but gave widows almost nothing. And society accepted this as natural, as the way things should be. Women were not seen as individuals with rights. They were seen as dependents, and when their protector died, the system had no place for them. They were excess, burdens, problems to be ignored until they quietly disappeared. Eleanor wasn't a person to the legal system or to society. She was a failed dependent, and her suffering was proof that the system worked exactly as designed. Think about the safety nets that exist today. Welfare programs, social security, child support, shelters, food banks. Now imagine all of that gone. Imagine being told that your survival is your problem alone, that society owes you nothing, and that if you can't make it, it's because of your own moral failing. Would you survive? Would your children? Most widows in Eleanor's situation didn't last more than a few years. Malnutrition, disease, exposure, it all added up. Eleanor made it through the winter barely. Anne died in February, pneumonia. She was 6 years old. By March, Eleanor had lost 2 of her 3 children, and Mary was sick more often than she was well. Eleanor stopped trying to find work. She just sat in the cellar room holding Mary, waiting for the end. She knew it was coming, she could feel it. Her body had started to shut down. She couldn't eat without feeling sick. She couldn't sleep. Her mind wandered, slipping between memories and hallucinations. She thought she saw William playing in the corner. She heard Thomas calling her name. And through it all, Mary's thin, weak crying was the only thing tethering her to reality. Eleanor died in April, 3 months after Anne. The exact cause didn't matter. It was everything at once: starvation, exhaustion, grief, the accumulated weight of 6 months of suffering. Mary was found beside her mother's body 2 days later. A neighbor finally checked the room after noticing the smell. Mary was still alive, barely. The parish took her to the workhouse, where she died 6 weeks later from fever. She was 2 years old. Eleanor's entire family gone within a year of Thomas's death. No one recorded their story. No one remembered their names. They were just numbers in a parish register. 4 deaths in 1 year. Unremarkable, common, expected. The system didn't stop. It didn't change. Thousands of women became widows every year, and thousands of them fell into the same cycle of poverty and death. Society needed this system because it kept women dependent, controllable, powerless. A woman who could survive on her own, who had economic independence, was a threat to the social order. So the laws were written to prevent that. The jobs were structured to make it impossible. The wages were set so low that no woman could support herself, let alone children. And when women died because of this, when children starved, when families were destroyed, society shrugged and said it was unfortunate but unavoidable. The wealth and stability that families enjoyed, the property that passed from fathers to sons, the social order that kept everything running smoothly, all of it required the sacrifice of women like Eleanor. They were the price. The cost of maintaining a system that benefited everyone except them. Even after laws began to change, after widows were granted some property rights, after social programs were created, the core belief lingered. The idea that women without men were problems to be solved, burdens to be managed, rather than people deserving of dignity and support. The structures evolved, but the underlying attitude remained. Women were still expected to rely on men for survival. Independence was still viewed with suspicion. And the memory of women like Eleanor, women who'd been sacrificed to maintain the social order, was quietly buried. No monuments, no recognition, just silence. Because acknowledging what had been done to them would mean confronting the fact that the system wasn't broken. It had worked exactly as intended. And in some ways, in some places, it still does. The names change, the specifics shift, but the fundamental truth remains the same. Women alone are vulnerable. And society has always known it, accepted it, and done almost nothing to change it.